Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roberta, for inviting me to speak. I do feel, as Stephen said earlier this morning, I feel an interloper and imposter. Not only do I not work on Glastonbury, I don't really work on English material. I rather work on French things, and from that point of view, I'm very interested in Henry of Blois and his family. But Roberta asked me to give a sort of a very broad brush context for Henry's work at Glastonbury, and that's what I'm going to do. Henry of Blois, and you see him there on the famous Henry of Blois plaque. He is abbot of Glastonbury between 1120 and his death in 1171, so it's a very, very long abbacy. From 1129, he is also Bishop of Winchester. He also holds several other very rich ecclesiastical prebends, so he's a great pluralist. And I suppose one can't resist recalling St. Bernard's withering comment of Henry of Blois as that old seductor of Glastonbury, which sort of records, I suppose, reflects Henry's position as a great courtier churchman, a great pluralist, and someone who is involved in political intrigue at the highest level. His brother, of course, famously becomes a king, King Stephen, between 1135 and 1154, and Henry is obviously very involved in the politics of the anarchy, the battle for the throne between Stephen and his cousin, the Empress Matilda. Now, I've said it's a very long abbacy, and I'm going to talk perhaps quite a bit about the Civil War. Henry loses control of the abbey during the Civil War, probably in about 1140, and it's not absolutely clear, I think, when he regains that control. And Glastonbury was in an area that was under the Empress's control, and some of its lands were damaged by the wars. When Henry becomes abbot, there's the fragment that you've just seen, the masterly introduction by Ron Baxter to the fragments from Glastonbury. When he becomes abbot, he says that the whole thing is in a terrible mess. The revenues have been diverted to private pockets, and that the buildings are also in ruin, though of course it is rather in his interests to say this. Nevertheless, documentary sources do make it clear that he makes strenuous efforts to restore the abbey revenues, and that he does institute a major rebuilding program. And Adam of Domerham says that he rebuilds a princely palace, a bell tower, a new chapter house, a cloister, a lavabo, a refectory, an infirmary with an infirmary chapel, so the nucleus of a monastery, together with brew houses, stables, and a great stone gate. So it's a very fundamental reconstruction, except for the abbey church and the very venerable and much venerated old church dedicated to the Virgin. And as we've heard, Henry's works are destroyed in the fire of 1154 with a few remaining fragments. Back to that. Henry is the nephew of, to say that one of the sources that we know about Glastonbury from is William of Malmesbury's De Antiquitate, Glastonbury, which is dedicated to him. It talks a bit about the abbey that he inherited, and there are references to him in it. It's a quite difficult text in that it was heavily adjusted and interpolated over the following century, and the earliest surviving manuscript dates from 1247, so it's problematical. Henry found the monks very demoralized. His predecessors as abbots had been Norman abbots who had really tried to impose Norman liturgical approaches. Famously, Abbot Thurston, in trying to impose Norman chants, had started riots, and monks were killed, and Abbot Thurston had to leave the abbey. The monks seem to have asked William of Malmesbury to write about their saints, the saints that they have relics of in the abbey. And William starts to do this. He writes a bit, but what they really want him to do is to say that they have the remains of St Dunstan, and William can't accept that. He knows quite well that St Dunstan is at Canterbury, and so he's avoids that side of things. Nevertheless, he really reconstitutes the ideas of this veneration of this abbey with its foundation myths in the myths of time. Okay. Henry of Blois himself, he's a nephew of Henry I, great courtier at Henry I's court. As I say, for his brother, King Stephen, he works very hard most of the time to support Stephen between 1135 and 54. He is still important at Henry II's court. He, for instance, consecrates Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1162, but I think he's becoming very elderly then and is much less important, perhaps. He's a great cultural patron, as these wonderful plaques suggest, and there's a lot of work on Henry as a cultural patron. In this paper, I'm going to look at aspects of the career of someone who's so central to court culture for an understanding of Glastonbury and an understanding of court culture. And the court culture of Henry I is extremely rich. Henry is the richest king, I suppose, in Europe at the time, renowned as tremendously rich, with a sort of stable country and, I suppose, a stable realm. And it's perhaps not surprising that his court is an extraordinarily rich one. And in a sense, I want to look at what happens with that court culture in the Anarchy, very briefly. I think there are parallels here with what happens with the rich and protean religious culture of Henry I's court. It is protean. Henry I and those around him both support Cluny, but they also support a very wide range of reformed orders. But during the Anarchy, what happens is that Stephen and Henry of Blois become increasingly connected with, associated with Cluny itself and with the less reformed, if you like, of the new reformed orders. In particular, at a stage when the Savignac order is taken over by the Cistercians, Stephen and the Savignac monks in England object. Stephen, great supporter of Savigny, backs the Savignacs, and he's seen as being, he is increasingly perceived as being anti-Cistercian, against the sort of the really cutting-edge new orders. And it's true that no new Cistercian abbeys are founded on any lands controlled by Henry of Blois, at a stage when a lot of Cistercian abbeys are being founded in England. On the other hand, the Cistercians and Premonstratensians become associated with the Empress Matilda, and I think that at an early stage, both Stephen and Henry of Blois are supporters of the Cistercians, and it's the anarchy that sort of drives them to take up these very differentiated ecclesiastical, political positions. And I think, as I say, there are parallels in the material culture. Henry was a great nepotist. His family are very successful in France. His brother becomes Count of Champagne as well as Count of Chartres. Another brother becomes the Lord of Sully, and Henry himself, he owes his career as Henry I's nephew, and he pushes his nephews in every direction that he can. For instance, one of his nephews, Henri de Sully, he tries to have him made Bishop of Salisbury, York and Lincoln, but managed to get him made Abbot of Fécamp. Henry of Sully's work on the far screen. Another nephew, Hugh of Puiset, he has made Bishop of Durham, and there is Hugh de Puiset's work on the screen. They're great builders, very much in the tradition of their uncle. In fact, people have sometimes made comparisons, suggested that there are links between the works of Henry of Blois and the works of those connected with him. People particularly compared the work of Henri de Sully at Fécamp with Henry's work. Well, the church at St. Cross at Winchester, the hospital founded by Henry, I think the problem there actually is that when I looked again at Henry's actor, in fact he hands over St. Cross to the hospital, as I think before the church would be built. So there are issues there. Henry I's reign, it's one of enormously ambitious building projects, I think, throughout England. Absolute hallmark of his reign. As I say, very rich, very stable. These building projects are quite difficult because in many cases the remains are very fragmentary, but everything we know about them suggests that they're rich, elaborate, often innovative, using rib vaulting, sometimes multicolored stone, innovative plans like the chapter house at Worcester, courtyard castles like Roger of Salisbury's at Old Sarum. Not all of these projects are connected with Henry I's court directly, but many of them are. I think there's a great boost to building in London at this stage, particularly because Henry's Queen Matilda is based at Westminster, and she founds Holy Trinity Aldgate, the great Augustinian house in London. Henry's own great building is Reading Abbey, founded as his mausoleum, very richly worked stone, and that's a view of the chapter house, which gives a sense of the imperial scale that this is built on. And I think that Henry I's court is an absolute forcing house, encouraging among those around him, like young Henry of Blois, a strong spirit of cultural and architectural emulation. One might think about, I've mentioned Bishop Roger of Salisbury, was mentioned in the previous paper, Henry of Blois as great builders. One might think from the literary point of view of the literary patronage of people like the Beaumont brothers and Robert of Gloucester. So a great forcing house. Now, what happens to this architecture as we move from the court-centered certainties of Henry I's reign to the fragmentation and uncertainty of Stephen's reign and the anarchy? There's lots of building in the anarchy, especially new foundations, especially a lot of Cistercians. But again, it's the parallel with the religious culture that emulation becomes political competition, I think. And Yeah. And I'd like to note that this period, 1135 to 1154, the period of the anarchy, coincides absolutely with the emergence of Gothic in northern France. Flowering of Gothic there is, I think, a response to their own very recent civil war, ecclesiastical anarchy between about 1127 and 1135, and at the end of it, suddenly there's great flowering of new work, very exciting work. And some aspects of these French approaches appear in England during the anarchy period. Perhaps most famously things like column figures, and people have pointed to sculpture from Saint-Denis, column figures on the far side, an English copy at Rochester, and this very beautiful fragment from Henry of Blois' Wolsey Palace has been assumed to be the head of a column figure and very much compared to work at Saint-Denis. Another French Gothic element is the use of dark polished stone to really point up architecture, but and this dark polished stone perhaps very much introduced by Stephen and Henry of Blois. Stephen, of course, Count of Boulogne, has links with Flanders. Here is Purbeck stone from Faversham, Stephen's Abbey of Faversham, and where he used Purbeck, as we've seen, Henry of Blois used blue lias at Glastonbury. Where does Henry of Blois' work at Glastonbury fit within this dating context, I think? Very interesting. I'm almost having to rethink this from some of the fragments that Ron showed. When does Henry begin building at Glastonbury? Presumably he begins building in the 1120s. How much has he done before he loses control around 1140? When could he resume works? Perhaps 1150, we don't know. He has to retreat to France in 1155 to 1156. He goes to Cluny, he sorts out their financial crisis there. The Glastonbury estates, as I've said, were damaged in the Civil War, but how much effect did this have? How much is Henry's work? What is done over this very, very long period? And we've seen from Ron's paper where he's sort of suggested that some of those fragments, perhaps very early indeed, are some linked with Herluin, or are some really very late within Henry's tenure of his abbacy. I was going to talk about Henry and Suger, but I can stop there if you like. Okay, right. Just briefly, okay. The link with Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis. Henry knew Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis very well. He goes there, particularly in the anarchy, where he's very involved in trying to arrange this succession after Stephen. Suger and Henry both write accounts of the administration of their abbey. Very famously, there are a lot of parallels between these, not least that they are written in the first person, not least that they're rather defensive about what they do, probably because both men have ensured that their monks are on a building site for the bulk of their abbacies. Both are great builders, and as I've suggested, and as many others have suggested as well, Henry has looked at some of Suger's work, and George Letsky made this comparison between Heads from Saint-Denis and Wolsey Palace. And there certainly is cultural tourism in this period. Jocelyn of Salisbury goes to Saint-Denis, shown round by Abbot Suger, and an interpolation into William of Malmesbury's De Antiquitate, talks about monk of Saint-Denis a monk of Glastonbury going to Saint-Denis, probably with Henry of Blois, and talking about rivalry between Saint-Denis and Glastonbury, which is the grander and older. Both have churches that have been consecrated by Christ, but finally the monk of Saint-Denis says, but where Glastonbury has it over Saint-Denis is that Glastonbury is called the Second Rome. That is not explained further.